by contrast, sort of knows the man to be somewhat cranky and thinks he can talk him out of it. So he crouches over and zigzags and makes his way up to the door of the house and somehow enters the house. And then he emerges in short order with the suspect, who's now much calmer. And Andy has, as usual, talked him out of it. And no arrest is made, if you can imagine that. Fourth and finally, Andy genuinely cares about and tries to help the people of Mayberry, having their best interests at heart. See, for example, his gentle treatment of Otis, the town drunk. And as a result, he has the trust, admiration, and respect of the townspeople. Now, of course, as I mentioned, Andy Griffith's show was fictional, and there's no doubt that many, many small-town sheriffs in America over the decades have probably been anything but peaceful. Yet it's fascinating that just a few decades ago, Americans could identify with the character of Sheriff Taylor as a recognizable ideal. So we fast forward to 2014, and clearly Norman Rockwell's America is mostly gone. Obviously, the situation today is very different, and we all know that police have suffered a very serious decline over the last several decades, both in terms of their public image and the degree to which average citizens now often fear police officers rather than trust them. Now, as an aside, some minority and poor communities have long been less trusting or perhaps less naive about the real nature of police. But today, that more jaundiced view has started to make its way into middle-class consciousness. Now, the subject of police misconduct and the growing militarization and lawlessness of police forces could fill many hours, so we won't try to cover such a broad topic today. And several libertarian writers are doing a tremendous job documenting police malfeasance. In my opinion, William Norman Grigg is the best out there on the subject, and I really encourage you to look him up because he's doing important work. But today, allow me to mention a few particularly egregious recent examples of police escalating and harming rather than protecting and serving. The first case you might have heard about is very recent. It's heartbreaking. A 90-pound mentally ill young man was very recently killed by 3 so-called law enforcement officers from 3 different agencies in the town of Southport, North Carolina. He was apparently having a schizophrenic episode and brandishing a screwdriver when police arrived in answer to his own family's 911 call for help. Well, some help. The first 2 officers managed to calm him down a bit, but the third officer arriving later escalated the situation, demanding that the other 2 officers use their tasers on this poor young man. And once his body hit the ground, this young person was brutally shot at close range and killed by the third officer for reasons that remain unclear. So here we really see modern police at work. Escalation, aggression, a lack of common sense making a bad situation worse, overriding concern for the safety of police officers, regardless of the consequences for those being protected. These are not the hallmarks of peace officers, to put it mildly. A second case you might have heard about happened in Fullerton, California in 2011, and Will Grigg has written extensively about this horrific and brutal police crime, where a homeless man was sadistically beaten and suffocated by about 5 or 6 different officers after a routine loitering stop. Now, he was fairly slender of build, and he did have a history of mental health issues, but the toxicology report done after his death found no trace of drugs or alcohol. And it really seems just an instance of 6 officers wildly overreacting to a homeless man who was perhaps loitering outside of a private business. Now, this attack took place over almost 10 minutes, and ultimately the man died. Well, ultimately the man suffered numerous broken bones in addition to the constriction of his airway by the force of 6 men laying and sitting on him during this beating. A beating during which, I might add, he begged and pleaded for his life, but to no avail. And once he was adequately subdued, the police made sure to take their good time in summoning an ambulance for him. And when the ambulance did come, they made sure that it attended to the very minor injuries of the police officers first. Of course, the officers claimed that they were merely using justifiable force, and criminal charges for second-degree murder and manslaughter against 2 of the officers involved recently resulted in an acquittal. And as a result of that acquittal, the district attorney dropped the charges against the third officer. Now, depending on one's point of view, these officers may be seen as nothing more than vicious gang members guilty of murder. Or for a virulent law and order type, they may be seen in an exceedingly charitable light, simply as overzealous cops involved in an unfortunate situation that got out of hand. But in no universe can they be seen as peace officers. Now, in addition to the countless individual cases of police malfeasance, we've also seen the troubling development that demonstrates how far we've strayed from the peace officer ideal, and that is, of course, the increasing militarization of local police departments. I saw an interesting story last week about the relatively small city of Fort Pierce, Florida, 42,000 people population. They recently acquired, the police there recently required an MRAP vehicle, which stands for Mine Response Ambush Protection Vehicle, for the bargain price of $2,000. The reason for this is that the U.S. military is unloading hundreds of armored tank-like vehicles as Operation Enduring Freedom winds down, and it's also unloading thousands of Afghanistan and Iraq combat vets into the ranks of local police and sheriffs. The Fort Pierce police chief states that the military was pretty much just handing them out. You know, it is overkill until we need it. So that was his quote. Now, a little closer to home, this is, I guess, amusing to me somewhat. A similar type of vehicle known as a BAT, a B-A-T-T, or Ballistic Armored Tactical Transport, has found a home just down the road here in Lake Jackson, Texas, hometown to Dr. Paul. When Ron and Carol arrived there in the late 60s, I think the population was only 8,000 or 10,000. It's now about 27,000. Now, this BAT employs thermal imaging cameras, and it holds up to a dozen officers, which is puzzling, considering that Lake Jackson has a crime rate, both for violent and property crimes, of less than half the national average. Now, Ron and Carol undoubtedly think of their hometown as a bucolic little place where they raise their 5 kids, but apparently it's ripe for a full-scale riot, necessitating an armored response. So, you know, we joke, but of course these are merely anecdotes. But we should not be surprised when military hardware, former military personnel, and ultimately a military mindset finds its way into our local police departments. And increased federal funding of otherwise cash-strapped municipalities and counties only weakens the connection between peace officers, police officers, and the citizens they ostensibly serve. So, how did we go from peace officers to police officers to law enforcement officers anyway? How did we go from protect and serve to apparently escalate and harm? And what's behind the militarization of police departments and the rise of the warrior cop, as one libertarian writer puts it? Well, as Austrians and libertarians, we should hardly be surprised, and we certainly don't need a sociological study to understand what's happening. The deterioration in police conduct and the militarization of local police forces quite simply and quite predictably mirrors the rise of the total state itself. We know that state monopolies invariably provide worse and worse services for more and more money. And police services are no exception. When it comes to your local police, there is no shopping around, there is no customer service, and there is no choice. Without market competition, market price signals, and market discipline, government has no ability nor incentive to provide what people really want, which is peaceful and effective security for themselves, their families, their homes, their property. As with everything government purports to provide, the public wants Andy Griffith, but it ends up with the Terminator. Now, there is no lack of Austrian scholarship in this area. I would call this area the intersection between security services, state monopolies, public goods, so-called, and private alternatives. But if you're interested in the topic, I would initially direct you toward 2 excellent primary sources to learn more about how markets could provide security services that not only produce less crime at a lower cost, but could also provide those services in a more peaceful manner. My first recommendation is an obvious one. It's Murray Rothbard's Power and Market, which opens with a chapter entitled Defense Services on the Free Market. So right off the bat in this chapter, Mr. Rothbard points out, the inherent contradiction between property rights and the argument that state-provided police services are a necessary precondition to securing such property rights. Quote, economists have almost invariably and paradoxically assumed that the market must be kept free by the use of invasive and unfree actions, in short, by governmental institutions outside the market nexus. In other words, we're told that state-provided police services are a necessary precondition to market activity. But Rothbard points out that many goods and services are indispensable to functioning markets, such as land, food, clothing, and shelter for those market participants. And so he asks, must all those goods and services therefore be supplied by the state and the state only? Well, no, he answers. I'll quote again. A supply of defense services on the free market would mean maintaining the axiom of a free society, namely, that there be no use of physical force except in defense against those using force to invade person or property. This would imply the complete absence of a state apparatus or government. Defense in the free society, including police protection, would therefore have to be supplied by people or firms who, A, gain their revenue voluntarily rather than by coercion, and B, did not, as the state does, arrogate to themselves a compulsory monopoly of police or judicial protection. Another excellent starting point is Professor Hans Hoppe's essay, The Private Production of Defense. Here, Dr. Hoppe makes the case that our long-held belief in collective security is nothing more than a myth, and that, in fact, state protection of private property, our system of police, courts, and jails, is actually incompatible with property rights and economic reality. Speaking at the Mises Institute Brazil conference in 2011, Dr. Hoppe summarized the fundamental problem with state police services as thus, and I quote, the state is a monopolist of taxation, i.e., it can unilaterally, without the consent of everyone affected, determine the price its subjects must pay for the state's provision of perverted law. However, a tax-funded life and property protection agency is a contradiction in terms, an expropriating property protector. Motivated as everyone is by self-interest and the disutility of labor, but equipped with the unique power to tax, state agents will invariably strive to maximize expenditures on protection, and almost all of a nation's wealth can conceivably be consumed by the cost of protection, and at the same time to minimize the actual production of protection. The more money one can spend and the less one must work for it, the better off one will be. Well, this is really government in a nutshell. Both Rothbard and Hoppe discuss an insurance model for preventing crime and aggression, which makes sense from a market perspective. Rothbard posits that private police services likely would be provided by insurance companies which already insure the underlying lives and property involved. And as Rothbard states, it would be to their direct advantage to reduce the amount of crime as much as possible. Now, Hoppe takes this insurance concept farther, arguing that, quote, the better the protection of insured property, the lower are the damage claims and hence an insurer's loss. Thus, to provide efficient protection appears to be in every insurer's own financial interest. Obviously, anyone offering protection services must appear to be able to deliver on his promise in order to find clients. That is, he must possess the economic means, the manpower as well as the physical resources necessary to accomplish the task of dealing with the dangers, actual or imagined, of the real world. On this count, insurance agencies appear to be perfect candidates. Now compare this with the growth model of most local police departments, which continuously lobby their city councils for more and more money and more officers. Now, admittedly, the private provision of police and security services is a complex and controversial subject, and we're only touching on it today. But rest assured that if you read further, both Rothbard and Hoppe address